episode 14 of the Armchair Scholars podcast. Nick, please do us the great honor of introducing our guest.
Our guest today is Dr. Joshua Ackerman. He was a professor of marketing at MIT, and he's currently a professor of psychology and marketing at University of Michigan. He does a lot of research around evolutionary psychology, social cognition, and decision making, and he has, I think we saw over 4,500 citations.
Crazy.
Yeah, a lot of really interesting research across several different topics, and I think that they all kind of blend in some way, and it was super interesting to talk about. So Brendan, what were some of your favorite topics that we covered in this conversation?
Well, first of all, let me say, not only is he extremely intelligent, but he was extremely nice, and we just really both enjoyed the conversation we had with him. I think my favorite thing that we got to do was really dive in a little bit deeper into some of the psychology around what's been going on with COVID. I think that's going to be really valuable for people. Important to note, none of this was advice. It was just a couple people talking and wanting to just like think about some different ideas, but really fascinating that some of the work that he does around infectious disease in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we hope this was a really insightful conversation. I know that we took a lot away from it, so sit back, relax,
and enjoy the show.
Cool. So thanks for joining us, Dr. Ackerman. We really appreciate this. And just to start, we would like to hear a little bit about how you got into the work that you do and how you got to where you're at today.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Glad to be talking to you all. So how did I get here? Well, I think it's estimated that life on Earth has been here about 3.5 billion years. And so we could start there, I guess.
I love it.
Yeah, actually. So I would say that one of the starting points to how I got to where I am today really did happen in college, and I was trying to, like a lot of people, trying to figure out what is next and what to do with my life, and I ended up taking a particular class that kind of sparked an interest in a specific direction, and I came into college, and I was always kind of interested in psychology for whatever reason, and also I was playing around with some other directions in life as well. But I took a class on sociobiology, and that was a new idea to me at the time. And the class was taught by an anthropologist, but it was focused primarily on animal behavior and thinking about the evolution of animal behavior and how different species act the way they do, how primates especially engage in certain kinds of behaviors and why they do. But as part of that, sociobiology was sort of the precursor to evolutionary psychology. And so as a part of that class, we started talking about human behavior and thinking about human psychology through that lens was really exciting to me. And it kind of married some interest that I had in anthropology and psychology. So I started thinking a bit about that. I didn't really necessarily take it seriously as a career to begin with. I ended up applying for grad schools in an unrelated area of psychology, and decided that that's not what I was going to do. So I took time off after undergrad and worked for a bit, doing some random things, and decided eventually that I did want to go to school, and I was really interested in evolutionary psych. And so I ended up basically trying to figure out where I would want to do that, or where I could even do that. So I took a road trip and across the country, where basically I just went all of the places that for whatever reason, I don't know if it's some sort of quirk of fate or whatever it is, all the places that were doing sort of hardcore evolutionary psychology within psychology departments were in the Southwest of the US. So, and I was living in DC at the time. So I just took a road trip across the country and visited various schools and just basically had coffee or something with professors and asked them, were they looking for students and what were they working on at the time? so that kind of helped me clarify, where I might want to end up. And I actually ended up moving for a year before grad school to get some more research experience. I moved out to Arizona, and I spent some time working on the side, but also working in a bunch of research labs and getting a handle on what that really meant to do kind of evolutionary type work in psychology. And that was kind of the catalyst to get into grad school. And from there, it's just been sort of a similar chain of random events leading me in different places. So that was grad school. Then, for whatever reason, I ended up in a business school after grad school or after a postdoc. There is an actual story there, but it's not one that people usually like to hear when it comes to like choosing your career. I actually applied to faculty jobs in business schools on a bet, and so I made a bet with somebody that was in the lab I was postdocing in. There was a number of people going into business school from this psych lab, and we made a bet that if I got a job at business school, I would have to buy a fancy dinner because the salaries are much better in business school, and if I didn't get the job, he would buy the dinner. So I figured, if I get the job, I'm not going to be out that much money. It turned out that was not the case. It was the most expensive dinner I've ever bought. But
that friend knew what he was getting himself into.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He waited until we had a conference in Las Vegas, and so he picked a really fancy.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. So I spent some time in a business school, and then kind of as part of that was realizing that the kinds of things I was interested in working on, there were some connections with I was in a marketing department, so there was some connections there. But then I decided I really was primarily interested in psychology, and ended up moving to Michigan, in part because it's a great program, and in part because that's where my wife is. So everything sort of ended up working out.
Yeah, that's so interesting that like these things kind of just came about. I mean, obviously you were following your interests, but at the same time that like you were just open to these different experiences. And it seems like you were really able to incorporate all these different theories and these different fields into one, like going through these different experiences too.
Yeah, I don't think it was, looking back and telling the story, it seems a little bit more connected and maybe a little bit more linear than it really was. I think a lot of it was being open to doing different things, but also relying on people in my social network, like professors that I've worked with, to kind of, help out with directing me and trying to give tips in terms of like how I could think about framing the interest that I had in different kinds of ways, because the job market is not an easy thing. And so, especially coming out of school. And so having that kind of support network was really, really valuable.
Mm-hmm. Did you know that like becoming a professor and doing research was what your goal in heading into like your doctoral programs were? Or did you think that there was some other role in some other field out there that you'd want to jump into?
I think it was primarily what I wanted to do. So I knew enough about it. My dad at one point was a professor as well. And so I had some sense of like what that looked like in a different field, but had some sense of what that looked like. And after taking that time off between undergrad and graduate school, I was like using that to some extent as a chance to see what kind of like working in the corporate world would look like, and whether it fit kind of what I wanted out of life. And I realized it wasn't, largely. And I think that was a really positive realization, because I think it lets, if you know that, then you don't have as many opportunities to second guess yourself when you are going through the ups and downs of graduate school. So I think that really sort of solidified my view on what I wanted to do after school.
Yeah. It's crazy too. It sounds like, based on the like picture you've painted for us about your like kind of path to your current role, that you've been very patient, maybe is the best word, in like determining each step of your process. Do you feel like for most people, even just like taking a little time off, like really exploring, like just the idea of like having coffee with potential future professors is something that I don't think a lot of people even think about doing. So in the context of like going to school, picking your major, like most people, like you mentioned, don't really know what they want to do when they're heading into undergrad. Did you consciously make that decision of like, hey, I'm going to really take my time with this and like make sure I'm making the right decision? Or was it something that just kind of happened based on the circumstances that you kind of worked through?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I did take my time in terms of not really trying to think too much about the future, but I think that's also a pretty privileged position to have. I know for a lot of people just aren't in that kind of situation where they could think about spending a lot of time in graduate school or think about taking time in between the various jobs that they have to just kind of see what's out there. I think to some extent, that is partly an aspect of privilege, and another view on that is that it's not just privilege. It's also, I think, we sometimes train people to think about what the kind of right path is, and a lot of times the right path doesn't, at least in people's minds, it doesn't have. It doesn't have. I don't know if you call it gaps or if you would call it, detours, but so the fact that I could, the year before I ended up going to graduate school, move out to Arizona and just basically work in restaurants as a way of supporting myself, while doing volunteer research in labs. That's not something I think people normally think about doing.
Mm-hmm.
But I encourage people to think about that, because
Yeah.
if you really want to be doing something down the road and you have a good sense of that, then I don't think that that's necessarily like that sort of detour. It's anything to look down on or anything to like think to yourself, oh, I'm not necessarily getting to where I want to go quick enough. But it obviously does require you to be okay with thinking, not thinking about like the immediate future.
Yeah, I've heard it this like basically what you did described as like tasting different industries and roles and pieces of your potential career path, because if you're going to dedicate your life to a field or something of that nature, yeah, like you really should like get in there and figure out if you enjoy it. And by being working for free, essentially volunteering in research labs and being a waiter, like you said, for a few years, like it takes a very self-aware and humble perspective to be okay, at least in today's day and age, I would say. We put a lot of pressure, and this is obviously some of the work that you've done also on some of the stigmas around, being in graduate school and things of that nature. But yeah, it takes a lot of self-awareness to know that like you not only want to go try this, but like you're going to take maybe a step down in quality of life for a short period of time to see it through and make sure that this is a reality you want to follow through for with yourself. So I think that's like really good advice for people to hear who are potentially thinking about graduate school, because I don't think that gets talked about enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and again, not everyone can do it, but I know that like when I was spending that year just working in restaurants and so on, all of my furniture at that time was either inflatable or just boxes that I threw sheets over. So I think I like slept on an air mattress and I had an inflatable couch, and it was definitely a humble existence at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think way too often we think about like career path as like a linear process.
Yeah.
And if we experience a setback or something that we don't like, then it's like we internalize that and we think that we're failures now and we can't push back from that. And
yeah, I see it a lot in student undergrads right now. I mean, they're constantly looking for more things or they feel compelled to add more and more things to their schedule. And they do, it's not a pleasant experience for them, and they do strongly risk burning out. And I think that it's kind of that sense of looking around at what other people are doing and feeling the social pressure, the social comparison pressure. And then it's the kind of like the normative expectations that are given to them by whether it's parents, general social environment, those kinds of things. But there are, I mean, I've listened to a number of podcasts with, various people in psychology talking about how they got where they are. And it's just a really diverse set of experiences that people have. There's no one path that people are taking to get to these places. So, having some at least mental flexibility around that stuff, I think is helpful.
Right. Yeah. So Brennan and I really enjoyed the article about the common academic experiences. And it was super cool to just hear different stories of the different people on that paper. And so, would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, this was a really interesting experience, actually. This didn't start as a paper, it actually started as a conference symposium. So the person who tried to organize the symposia was it's a faculty member, an assistant professor, and she was interested in like talking about these kinds of issues because she encountered a bunch of students that have experienced these things, and that's not, unfortunately, not difficult to find. Right, there's students in every program who are experiencing all these challenges of dealing with being in school and just dealing with life in general. And so she invited a number of different people. She actually put out an open call for people who might be interested in doing this, but then invited a number of people. And we ended up getting together a group of, I think we started with 6. I think we started with 6 people. And at the symposium, this was at the Society for Personality and Social Psychology meeting. And so we had this symposium where we basically just talked about specific topics. And so we divided it up into 3 topics with 2 people per topic. And the topics were rejection or repeated rejection, how you deal with that, how you think about that, imposter syndrome, and then basically professional burnout. And so the way we did it is that we basically talked about our own experiences with those topics and tried to sort of generate some insights that we had from going through those experiences, or pseudo words of wisdom around those topics. And it was probably, out of all of my conference talk experiences, it was certainly the largest audience, and I think the most involved audience. So we gave all our talks about this, but then we had a lot of time for audience participation where people were talking about their own experiences. And I think it strongly resonated with a lot of people at that. And so what we ended up doing was putting together a paper that brought together these kinds of the same people, but also we brought on some additional people as well, and to write about these experiences. And I think eventually the next year at the conference, they did another repeat round of this with all new panel members to give new experiences, because not everybody's experience dealing with one thing is going to be the same as everyone else's. And that was also another very well attended event. And so it was, I think, in some sense, both, I don't know if humbling is the right word, but humbling, as well as concerning, honestly, to sort of see how many people felt like this really did resonate with them, and how many people are going through these same kinds of experiences. I think so. I was mostly involved with the rejection topic with this, and I think the rejection topic is, in some sense, it's a little easier because it's not necessarily like imposter syndrome is, this experience that people are having that is strongly internalizing this negativity around yourself. Burnout also has got a lot of negativity to it. Those are both things that you may or may not experience. Rejection is something you have to experience. And so because of that, at least if you're in grad school or an academic career, and so because of that, it's almost like it's a safe one to talk about, because everyone will be experiencing it. So you don't have to make assumptions about people. But the hard part for me, I guess, the weird thing for me with this was that I volunteered to do this shadow CV, which, if you're not familiar with them, the shadow CV is this idea of putting together not a typical CV that includes all of your hits. So the papers you might have published, the talks you've given, the jobs you've received, awards, this kind of things. The shadow CV is all the things that you got rejected on. And so it's all the jobs you applied for but you didn't get, all the awards you applied for didn't get, all the papers that got rejected, all the talks that didn't get in. and so on. And so I put this thing together, and it was that was a humbling experience, I guess, to see how much goes on that CV. And so that ended up being part of the talk in the paper as well. And that was a little bit nerve wracking to like just kind of put yourself out there in terms of like, because you don't really always know like the number of rejections you're getting approximating what other people are doing, or am I like seriously failing at this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm curious too, when you looked at the three categories that you guys, had in the symposium, were there any common themes that came up in terms of how people can overcome some of um the feelings of like imposter syndrome or being rejected? How can people work through those things?
Yeah, I think that, well, what works for one person isn't always going to work for another person, simply because um, what imposter syndrome means to you might not be the same as what it means to somebody else, and so on. Some people are very resilient to rejection, and some people are not. And so the themes that seem to come up, whether it was in the talk or whether it was afterwards, talking with other people and seeing the feedback on the paper and so on, were things like, well, one of them I think in some sense is a common theme, but I've seen it most prominently discussed by Mark Schaller, which is he has this idea of how people identify with their research topics. And he suggests that really you should do your best to think about the topics that you study as being a very separate thing from your own identity. They may be part of your research identity, but they're not part of your self-identity, right? And the idea there is you aren't the topics that you study, and you might even, I mean, there's like crazy ideas about like, oh, maybe we should just randomly assign all researchers to topics, and they shouldn't even get a say in what they're doing, because that would help to reduce the biases that people bring to the table. But part of what that would do as well is it would divorce this sort of sense of identity with the things you study. And the problem of that overlap is that when you do get rejected, and you will get rejected on papers or other kinds of things, even if it's just like someone wants you just to revise your idea, that still can be interpreted as a rejection. It can, at least in what I've seen with students that I've worked with and others, is that those experiences of rejection can get interpreted not just as like something about the work, but something about the individual. And that is a really hard thing to overcome if you're interpreting those rejections as something about you and your worth as a person or as a scholar, and so on. So I think, that's part of, I think, an important aspect of what people need to be doing, which is, it's not easy to do, but it is to basically say, I might be really interested in this topic, but if I get feedback on it that it needs to get edited in some way in terms of the particular work that I'm doing, that's the work. It's not me. So that's part of it. In terms of imposter syndrome, I think that I hate saying what I just said and this next thing I'm going to say, because sometimes it comes across as targeting the people who experience these things and suggesting they need to do something to change. And I think to some extent that is the case, right? So to some extent, people do need to be very deliberate in terms of how they think about the work that they do and the experiences that they have as part of that work. But it's obviously not the case that everything is about blaming the individual or putting it on the individual. So for instance, I would suggest that when it comes to imposter syndrome, a big component of that is social comparison and who we pay attention to, because from the outside, it looks like, you don't see the shadow CV for everyone else. You don't see the failures that other people are experiencing. So it seems like people are doing really well. And that's especially the case when people choose, and I don't think people always consciously do this, to like choose social comparison targets, like who you're going to compare yourself to. But that's really effectively what people are doing. If you choose people that are like the stars of the field to compare yourself to, then you probably will experience a lot of imposter syndrome around that, because again, you're seeing their successes. And if they're the stars, they're having success. And so I think it's really important to be conscious and deliberate in terms of who you compare yourself to. Pick people that are going to be motivating if you compare yourself to them, not people that are going to be demotivating. And I think there's some techniques to do that. But then I think a part of this whole process of doing this symposium and this paper was to really think about what are the institutional changes that could really help. So, I mean, I think it is the case that we could make some broader changes to how some of the things that we do that aren't just on the the role of the student as the individual, but how we sort of frame work. So, for instance, I now have an editing position at a journal, and so I get to see the other side of things in terms of like how reviewers what they communicate behind the scenes, but also things like I think that there should be a role for editors to dictate the tone of conversation when it comes to, let's say, journal reviews or manuscript reviews at journals. So the experience of getting a paper rejected, for instance, can be, is not pleasant for people. And it's especially not pleasant if the reviewers are jerks, right? And they use, whether it's language or other kinds of things that are really going after the person as the author. And I think that institutionally, or sort of as a system, as a field, we could basically say that, hey, it's the editor's role to control that. And it's not helping to use that kind of tone or use those kinds of remarks. It's not helping the work. And so we shouldn't just be, for instance, as editors, just turning the reviews over to authors without paying attention to what the impact of that's going to be. Not to say that there should be editing of these specific suggestions or comments about the work, but just the sort of, I'm basically advocating for tone policing a little bit. So those are some of the things that I think stood out in what I was paying attention to. And I think there's a lot more in the paper for other suggestions.
Yeah, there's so much here. And Brennan and I were discussing this a little bit before too, about how I feel like there, at least in our personal experiences, like your work reflects a lot of who you are. Like that's a message that's really sent out there. And while that can be positive because you want to really produce good work, it can be very toxic of you're only seen for what you produce and you're not seen for who you really are. So there's that like weird balance of that. And like you talking about CVs and also acknowledging the shadow CV, like we put out these, like people see us based on these things that we do and these accomplishments. And I don't know, maybe like just really utilizing like referral sources and recommendations and talking to people to find out more about who this person is useful. But yeah, that in just so many ways, I think, especially right now with everything being online, like if you're finding a new job, you're solely judging a person based on like what they put down, right? And it's so hard to connect on that personal level now. But yeah, it's such an important piece because I feel like in order for my own self-worth to feel validated, I need not just my work to be validated, right? Like I need myself, like who I am. And that's so challenging.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, I think that something that a lot of people probably neglect doing is taking the time to identify who they actually are aside from their work, right? Like if you can define that for yourself as like, I am X, Y, and Z person and make a nice list for yourself. So if anything at work goes wrong, you have this nice positive list of things that you can define yourself by that have nothing to do with the rejection that you just faced. I feel like that's something that a lot of people just don't even think about doing.
Mm-hmm.
That, I mean, it's a starting point for a lot of people to, start having, because like you were saying, a lot of people get so tied up in what they're doing that they just like, they don't even know who they are without the things that they're doing in their work. And if you haven't even had that conversation with yourself yet, it's going to be really difficult.
Yeah. I think it's really easy to get lost in your work, especially in kind of an academic type of discipline, because if you are at a kind of a job where there's no off switch necessarily, you're the one dictating that, then you can really just get immersed to a extreme degree. It's not like you shut off after a certain hour or something like that, unless you're really managing your own schedule in a way that I think most people don't do. So I think it's very easy for people to do that. It can really help, I think, to also have a social support network that is. I mean, there's different ways of doing this. So you could think about like other people that you talk to about like not just the successes but also the failures. So it's normalized, and you can vent to people, or you can get support when something does go wrong from those other people, or even if it's people that are not actually in the same not in academia at all, right? So people that do are able to shut off after 5 or 6 o'clock, and who don't necessarily have that same sense of inherently meshed identity with their work. Talking to those people, I think, gives you some perspective on what things could be like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When you look at this from like maybe an evolutionary standpoint, and you're talking about like support networks and systems, and going back to, like you said, like 3.5 million years ago, we were in tribes and all. Can we like take anything from there when we look at evolutionary psychology as far as like what humans probably like were developed to need when it comes to facing rejection or these like moments of negativity and anxiety? Is there anything like, what kind of stuff do you think of when I say that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. So I don't know if something like imposter syndrome is something that's existed for our species, entire history, but rejection has, and it's typically been social rejection. And so I think it's very easy to interpret, like for instance, workplace or academic rejection as social rejection. And we know from a lot of research that social rejection is one of the most damaging experiences that people can have for their mental health. And does have an evolutionary basis. I mean, so people who were frequently experiencing social rejection in small groups, when we were living in somewhat smaller groups, that would have been a really sort of dangerous line to walk with respect to, are you going to be able to survive into the future? Because if people are rejecting you, you might not be getting that support that you need in order to weather downturns in finding food or economic resources of various sorts, or you might get excluded from the group entirely, which is basically a death sentence in many places. The other big piece of this is that social rejection is linked a lot to status, and so it's not just the being a member of the group; it's also like how you see your position in it. Are you somebody who is getting the benefits, I guess, of feeling like you're more powerful in a group, or that you have some control over your own destiny, and you can get the other additional potential gains that come from higher status? So experiencing these kinds of events in a very almost artificial setting that we have in kind of the workplace I think, can be really easily interpreted through a different lens, and that is through the lens not necessarily just of the workplace, but also this idea of, if my paper's rejected, that suddenly that's hurting my inherent sense of status. It's hurting my sense of like, are people going to want to collaborate with me? Am I worth talking to? All these kinds of things. And so having an additional social support network where you can turn to can help, I think, to reestablish that sense of inclusion, or having that you're not at the bottom of the hierarchy necessarily, that you have these people that are there even if you do get rejected in these other domains. So I think there is, as you're saying, some important connections to aspects of our evolutionary past that play out in terms of these academic experiences.
Yeah, I'm even thinking in terms of what some sources of social rejection could have been, way back in like the hunter-gatherer tribal days. And I'm thinking that, a lot of the circumstances that would have been, around daily life for somebody, in those times would have been very much group oriented. I wonder if there's anything to the idea of like changing the perception of your, maybe it's research in the case that we're talking about with getting something published, where, thinking of the work that you're doing as a greater contribution to a group of people rather than something that specifically defines yourself. Because I just think that when you tie up, like we were talking about before, your personal individual identity in your research, as opposed to I'm doing this research to further the discussion and the discovery around this topic. I feel like you can be like, okay, it got rejected. It wasn't providing enough value to the group of people. I need to go forward and do more research to provide more value to my group, to my tribe, to the world of psychology, whatever that may be. I wonder if just framing that in a slightly different way could be a way of helping people in the process of like making sure that people are thinking of it in that context as they're going through their work, to maybe remove the identity piece from the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that one of the things you said in there was this idea of framing these experiences as almost part of a discussion. And I think that is actually important, not just in the context of these experiences we're talking about now, but in the context of understanding the whole scientific process more generally. And I think would be a worthy kind of sea change in terms of the how we frame, whether it's in terms of like training students or just thinking about people's views on science as a whole, framing them as part of a conversation or part of a discussion. So if you experience rejection, it's basically like somebody just disagreeing with you. Well, now it's still part of it, and you're still having an ongoing conversation with them, and you can continue that conversation. It doesn't like somebody says no, you don't just walk away.
Yeah, the conversation's not over.
Yeah, right. And same thing with yes, right? I mean, I think that's equally important, right? So, so if you get something accepted, it's not the end. And I think that part of it is the framing that we have in our heads, but I think that comes from somewhere. And it comes from the incentive structure that we have set up for a lot of academic jobs, which is like you get the publication and it gives you this value for your career. And you have to, I mean, there's got to be some type of incentive structure for jobs. But by doing that, I think we, in some sense, implicitly maybe highlight the idea that when you've got that thing you can add to your CV now, that hit, that's the end. That somehow you've like crossed the threshold and that's it.
Made it.
Yeah, but that's just not how it works, right? This is like papers. People publish lots of papers on the same topic. Why do they do that? It's because it's not any one paper is not the endpoint, and we should think about it as this like broader conversation. And I think if we had a way of doing that more broadly, then I think it would also help with these issues that we've been discussing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's been fascinating for myself, and Brennan has discussed this too, about in our conversations with different professors, we've just always gotten this takeaway of the importance of social support. And it's so interesting because like we're in this individualistic culture to where you need to do things on your own and be independent and achieve. And like in every context, whether it's recovering from like a traumatic experience or ending a sport that you've been doing for so long, like these damages to our identity that, or maybe we feel like they're damaging our identity. It's so important to have these people and this external validation from others. And so, yeah, it's so interesting to hear all about different types of research that you've done and where you found very similar things. Because, yeah, evolutionarily, it seems like that's just such the case. And it seems like it's so basic, but we miss it so easily.
Yeah, I agree, and it is something that is valued in our culture, like the idea of individualism in our culture, but also just in, again, the incentive structures that we have at a lot of these jobs. People stress. I mean, I sit on some of these promotion committees for faculty, and people stress the idea of independence, and they want to see what the independent contribution of these people are to know if we should promote them. And again, to some extent, that makes sense, but there's lots of ways to get there. And so I personally found that, collaboration in research is one of the most exciting aspects of doing this work. And you can establish independence through collaboration a lot of times. People don't always think that, but it's really about who you're collaborating with, making sure it's diverse groups of people and changing up your role. And that's enough to make that kind of a mark. But I know that like when I was in grad school, like my favorite times during that experience were having a group of people that we could just throw ideas around with. And I know like we often did it just out at the bar. And so we would like go and get drinks and just talk about ideas. And having that group, it's in some sense that's a support network. It doesn't have to be the only version of a support network, but it is one that could both be supportive and maybe further your own professional goals as well. So I guess there's some dual benefits there.
Yeah, because you feel like comfortable and confident to throw out your ideas and feel like they're going to be heard, right? Like there's a huge value in that. Yeah, that's awesome.
I connect a lot of what we're saying with the AA model, and I'm by no means an expert on the model, but it feels like there's a lot of opportunity to utilize what people are getting out of the structure of the group meeting, being able to share like everything you're talking about in other settings. It doesn't have to be exclusive to AA. I mean, people can utilize that benefit of sharing community and all of those things in a setting for other, like, the AA of rejected grad students,
Right.
there could be a lot of value in that same type of, opportunity.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's something that it's just so clear from the research that's been done on social networks and social support and so on, that it's so important for physical and mental health that it's sort of surprising that we don't make that even more of a priority than it already is. And it obviously is a priority for a lot of people, but that's obviously been one of the struggles over the last year in terms of how people are dealing with things. So
yeah, it's a shame because I feel like if there's somebody who struggles and maybe they don't overcome some of these obstacles and they don't have this social support network, then they're just seen as like, oh, well, they were too weak, so they couldn't do this work. So it's good that they got thrown out. When it's like, maybe there was a lot of untapped potential that if they got supported, could be amazing things that come from that.
Yeah, I agree. And this is part of the reason there's different kinds of cultures in academic programs. And this is one of the reasons I'm not really a big fan of those sink or swim kind of cultures that exist.
We're weeding people out.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yes, some people are going to perform better than others on certain kinds of things, but it probably is going to be for everybody's benefit if there is that bigger focus on crafting a supportive environment that's going to help people establish collaborations, help people find sources of support, not just kind of like have them figure it out for themselves.
Yeah, so to shift a little bit, when reading some of your research, I thought it was super fascinating to name the behavioral immune system. I think everybody has a general idea of what the immune system is, but specifically the behavioral immune system. And it was really interesting to think about how you've been doing this work prior to COVID, and now here's a huge experiment. So I guess if you could just talk a little bit about like what the behavioral immune system is, and then maybe some of the research and work that you've done around that topic.
Yeah, sure. So the behavioral immune system is, I'll start out by stressing something about it that people don't always actively pay attention to, and that is behavioral immune system is an idea. It's not a thing that is inside our bodies or our heads. It's an idea. And so in some sense, it's an analogy, right? So we know about this physiological immune system that we have, right? Which is an incredibly complex set of processes that are designed to address pathogens and other kinds of things that get into the body, right? And there's a lot of ways that those get addressed once they're in the body. And so there's a lot of different processes involved there. It's not just a single system. It's a system of a lot of things. But the major downside of the physiological immune system is, well, there's multiple. I mean, it takes a lot of energy. It can cause a lot of collateral damage. So it turns out a lot of, like, for instance, the side effects of getting a vaccination or many diseases are actually, the harms that we get from those are a lot of times actually due to our immune system, not due to the disease itself. Our immune system just goes crazy. And so it causes collateral damage. But the big picture problem with the physiological immune system is that for it to do anything effective, you have to get infected. So those germs have to get inside you. And obviously that's a risky proposition, right? Because who knows what's going to happen. And so the idea of the behavioral immune system is to think about, okay, is it possible that there is a psychology of infection or psychology of infectious disease, pathogens, parasites, et cetera, that could potentially help people to avoid that initial infection in the first place? And if so, is it something that we just had to learn through the advent of modern medicine? Like, once we know germ theory, do we now have to just get trained in how to do this stuff? Or is it possible that we have an evolved behavioral immune system that we've been, over the course of our species history, how we've been using aspects of our psychology to keep us safe from potential pathogenic dangers that exist out there? So that's the idea of what the behavioral immune system is, and it involves a lot of things. It involves like thinking about certain kinds of situations and certain kinds of people as potentially being bad or threats at the level of germs. It involves certain kinds of emotions. Oftentimes, the biggest one is disgust. So thinking about how people react with disgust. Disgust seems to be particularly tied towards keeping things out of the body. And other kinds of behaviors that people use to not always top of mind keep them safe from infection, but engage in ways that actually do functionally help them to not become infected. So we study a lot of those various aspects of this behavioral immune system. Again, thinking about potentially this idea that this is something that is, to some extent, largely evolved. And the thinking around that is, well, you can look to see in, across cultures, people are doing oftentimes very similar types of thinking and feeling and behaviors in the context of pathogen threats. And you can look across species at other animal species, insect species, and so on, that do very similar kinds of activities to protect themselves from illness or infection. And because of that, you can potentially say that this is probably something, to some extent anyway, that has a large evolutionary component to it, that it's adaptive for the kinds of environments we would have existed in for long periods of time. So we study things like everything from visual attention. So what do people pay attention to when they're concerned about disease? Are they looking at specific kinds of people? Are they orienting towards specific kinds of threats? Because you think about attention, well, pathogens are pretty much invisible. And so you're not going to be able to walk around and say, hey, there's the disease, there's the germ. There's some exceptions to that if you think about things like parasitic worms. So some of those you can see. But typically what you're looking at is the symptoms of infection in either other people. So do they show things that look potentially abnormal or that we naturally associate with potential disease, or other kinds of substances like food? So contaminants in food, is there mold? Does it smell bad? All of those kinds of sensory properties can suggest something about whether there's harm, potential risk there. So we study visual attention, like what are the features in people's faces that we look at. We have done some recent work on sound and thinking about how people pay attention to like coughs and sneezes and others. We've done a lot of this work on sensory properties, and the idea is, or sensory information. And the reason for that is because that's a big place where we get this kind of information about what kinds of germs exist out there in the world. Now, the other place we get it is from, we can call it conceptual information, and that's basically just like learning about what experts say, what the media says, and so on. And that type of information intersects with this idea of the behavioral immune system and can trigger it, so cause people to act in ways that where they become more averse to risks. But it doesn't always tend to be as strong, which I think suggests that the sensory information, which is probably more in line with the kind of evolved aspect of the behavioral immune system, we would have had access to like sight and sound and smell, across our species history. We wouldn't have access to like CNN or something across our species history. And so because of that, I think we're really tuned to the sensory information more than just the learned kind of conceptual information. So we try to understand if people are actively concerned about disease, how do they change their thinking? How do they change their feelings? How do they change their behaviors? or if they live in places in the world where there is more pathogens. So if you live closer to the equator where it's hotter and wetter, there, it's more of a breeding ground for different kinds of germs, and people actually get infected more frequently than if you live closer to the poles. And so because of that, we might expect that there's more of these kind of behavioral immune behaviors in those places where people get infected more frequently because they have to deal with this problem more. That's one hypothesis. And then the last piece that we've done a little bit of work on, and people are just starting to really get into this more, is the intersection between the behavioral immune system and the physiological immune system. So if you think about like some people's internal physiological immune systems work really well, and some people's don't work as well. And that can be due to certain kinds of conditions like autoimmune diseases or being recently sick, perhaps, or using immunosuppressant drugs, those kinds of things. Now, the behavioral immune system could potentially help out in those cases where people's physiological immune system doesn't work quite as well. And so we've started to try to study, is that the case? Are these things complementing each other in some type of way by looking at immune functioning in parallel with the behavioral side of things? So that's a very long-winded way of talking about what the behavioral immune system is.
Yeah, no, but it was so informative. And I'm curious about like positive consequences that can come from it. Obviously, you can maybe averse some of these more dangerous situations to where you don't want to contract this pathogen. But like, what are also some negative consequences, especially with like COVID now? I know that there's probably a heightened behavioral immune system amongst a lot of people, but not amongst everybody. But yeah, what could those look like?
Yeah, so this is a big focus, this idea of the negative consequences of behavioral immune system. And the reason is kind of going back to that idea that you can't see pathogens. All you can see are symptoms of infection in other people, or sometimes you don't even see symptoms. So like with COVID, you might not see symptoms at all. And so what can you rely on to suggest that somebody might be an infection risk? Well, you can rely on other kinds of heuristic cues that people present. So for instance, have you been around them recently? Do you know them? Is a simple cue. And if you've been around people and you know them well, then perhaps they're going to be less of an infection risk because especially if you've been around them, because you probably would have already gotten sick if they were infected. And so this idea of paying attention to cues, like how familiar is this person? Are they part of my group? Do they engage in behaviors that you find unusual? Because we know that, so for instance, social norms are a big aspect of psychology. And the social norms that we have, sometimes we can think about them as, oh, it's just weird that this culture does one thing and this other culture does another thing. We can think about it as just sort of unique aspects of culture, but they also might be, to some extent, solutions, functional solutions to manage the environment. And so some social norms can help people to prevent infection in places where infection is relatively high. And so if you see somebody who's not following the social norm, you might think, hey, that person there's something weird about them and I better stay away from them. So because of all of that, what you end up finding is that people who are concerned about disease, whether that's just part of their personality or whether they're actively thinking about it, they tend to, they pay attention to those cues more, those cues that are, whether somebody's familiar to you or not, actually doesn't probably tell you that much about whether they're sick. It might have no relevance at all, but people pay attention to it and they act on it. So what you see is that people become more avoidant of people who possess cues. And it could be that familiarity, it could be other kinds of things. Like, for instance, we've done some work on benign physical abnormalities, like having a birthmark on your face. Has nothing to do, or a scar has nothing to do with infection threat, but people treat it as though it's infection threat because it looks abnormal. And at some low level, they're not really thinking through this idea of like, oh, it's really a risk to me. It's just like, no, just get away. So that you get more avoidant of people. You see people express thought patterns that are related to avoidance, like prejudice. So prejudice is against certain groups of people. Typically groups of people that you might already associate with infection risk, or groups of people that are just like different than you. And so so when people are concerned about disease, you see increased levels of prejudice around there. And so we see that a lot these days with COVID. And the kind of whether it's within country prejudice or whether it's nationalistic kinds of prejudices, and a lot of those are probably spilling out because of these kinds of consequences of behavioral immune functioning, in addition to other things that are going on in society. So there's those kinds of negative consequences, and then you could think about other types of negative things that aren't as social. So, for instance, people who are really worried about germs, they often will also do things to try to manage their environment in ways that keep it looking orderly, or clean. I mean, we have to learn what clean means, but that can go too far, right? So people could become very obsessed with that kind of behavior, and that could change how they interact with other people. So it can lead people to sometimes even spend less time with their social networks and more time managing the cleanliness of their environment. You could think about extreme forms like OCD as connected to this kind of behavior as well.
Do you think that because you mentioned at the beginning of this change in topics that we started, do you think that we are continuously evolving towards a higher degree of behavioral immunity, or do you think we have devolved in our behavioral immunity and are getting further away from a more primal version of our tendency to avoid people who look strange and sick and potentially contagious?
Yeah, I would say that I don't think it's directional in any meaningful way. So I think it's just a continual process. So there's no good level of behavioral immune functioning, and there's bad levels, but there's no optimal level, except with respect to the current environment that you're in. And so if the current environment is changing, and it could be changing due to things like, well, you might move to a different place. There might be changes in the climate that cause differences. There could be changes in how we function as society, like introduction of sanitation and hygiene practices. All of that changes our environment. And so when our environment changes, the number of pathogen risks change. And so how our behavioral immune responses come out, and the strength in which they come out needs to change as well. And so it's a constant kind of coevolution, I think, between the kinds of behaviors and kinds of thought patterns we're using and the right levels to use them at with whatever's happening in the environment. And there's, if you want, we could talk a bit about this idea of, might be familiar with the hygiene hypothesis. Have you heard of this before?
No, please.
Not too much, yeah.
Okay. So there's this idea about, I don't know, it's probably pushing 30 years old now. And it goes by different names. The hygiene hypothesis is the most well known. Another one is called the good friends hypothesis. And the basic idea is the good friends, in that case, are people and germs. They're actually good friends. And the idea there is that for our physiological immune systems to work correctly, it is a process of being sensitive to what the environment is offering to us. And so what you tend to see, if you look, ignoring the behavioral immune system, if you look at how people's physiological immune system works, how well it works, then you find that people who have been exposed to germs as children actually have better functioning immune systems. And by that we mean they don't go too crazy, they don't underperform, they're more tuned to the kinds of dangers that exist out there in the world. Whereas if kids grow up in really sterile environments, their physiological immune system goes haywire sometimes when they're presented with a disease threat. It hasn't learned to tune itself very well. And this is one of the explanations that people have for why we've seen increased rates of things like allergies, asthma, autoimmune conditions. And it's the idea that we have cleaned our environment so much that we are not actually living in a setting where essentially our evolved systems can properly tune themselves, because they're expecting inputs from the external world. They're expecting germs. And so you get germs, and it tunes your system and it works better later on. And so if you don't have that, then you got problems. And so it's like one of the best predictors of whether you're going to have asthma or not. Do you grow up in a household with pets, or do you grow up on a farm? And so, because if you're, a dog's licking your face as a kid, or, got dirt around, that's a good thing, it turns out. We don't really think about it that way in our modern world, but it can be a good thing because we do have these evolved systems, but the evolved systems are slow, right? They're evolved for certain kinds of contexts. And so if you don't give them what they're expecting, then they don't really function very well. And I think we could expect very similar things with respect to the behavioral immune system, right? So if you grow up in a sterile environment versus a very unsterile environment, like you grow up in a city in the U.S. versus in the Amazonian jungle, in a small band of people, you're going to have very different experiences with the outside world, right? And so for instance, there are, I think, estimates of around some groups who live in areas in the Amazonian jungle, actually, 75 to 95% of them are infected with worms at any given time. And that's a lot of people to be infected with worms, right? But it turns out that, and worms have a problem, they damage your long-term health. But it also turns out that being infected with worms means you get sick less frequently. And so the idea is that the immune system is expecting worms. And if you get infected with worms, it helps to tune that. Now, doesn't mean everyone should have worms all the time, but there are actually some of these unique new therapies coming out where people who are suffering from certain kinds of immune conditions, one of the therapies is to infect them with worms, parasitic worms. And then what you see is that actually, even as adults, that can help to tune the system and help to reduce symptoms of those kinds of conditions. And I think we would expect that there's going to be similar kinds of outcomes at the behavioral side, because it's all just part of the same evolved mind and body that we have. And so the mind should also be expecting certain kinds of inputs from the outside world, not just the body. And so we should expect that we're going to see some unusual or too extreme responses as a result of disease threats when people grow up in places where they don't encounter very many disease threats. So we could see things like, if prejudice is an outcome of behavioral immune system, we could see way too strong prejudices emerging as a result of disease. That wouldn't happen necessarily if that system was tuned more appropriately.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I kind of think of the idea of microdosing as like the proper way of doing it, right? Like as a child, we play in the dirt, we get licked in the face by our dog, and we're getting just these micro doses. And same psychologically, right? Like I think if we are introduced to an environment that is not microdose, too extreme in one area, we may get a false response, like a too severe response as a reaction to that. So just like if we were to get too aggressive of a pathogen without a fully developed immune system, we would have this gigantic immune response that would go could be catastrophic. It could potentially be the same thing with our psychology. That's a very interesting concept that I think a lot of people are probably not privy to thinking about it in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting because there are domains of psychology where people pay attention to this idea, and then many domains where they don't. So for instance, one of the domains I think that people are paying more attention to with respect to this idea of early tuning is emotion regulation. So this idea of, should kids be exposed to failures or only successes, or should we praise everything they do or not? And it can have a later long-term effect on people's ability to cope with, kind of going back to the topic we were talking about before, cope with failures. And the ways in which they regulate those negative emotions can be maladaptive and very, not work out very well if they haven't experienced some of those early events, which is basically information from the environment telling us, here's what needs to get tuned.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I think about too, like you said, it could be negative at too young of an age, right? Like if they're not, I'm even thinking like if I was little, I think I would have a much different perception of losing the little league t-ball game, or like not being picked for the team, or struggling to tie my shoe, right? Just going back to this microdosing idea, like I can easily overcome in an afternoon the tying the shoe thing, maybe depending on my age. but like losing the t-ball game might be too severe for me at a certain age if I haven't fully adapted. So yeah, it's an interesting, like the whole emotional adaptation starting from an early age. That's a very interesting idea that we probably need to like build ourselves up to little, like very insignificant seeming failures early on to make sure they're not overly like damaging to our system from a as we continue to age, and then we can more easily adapt to the more severe losses and failures.
Yeah, and I think this is part of this benefit, the potential benefit of taking seriously this type of evolutionary perspective on psychology. One benefit of it isn't just that it can help you come up with new ideas for research. It's also a way of thinking about how our minds and our bodies are set up from the get-go, and what they might be, what kinds of environments, what kinds of information they might be expecting. And if we want to promote promote healthier and more functional development in people, we need to think about what we're starting with. We're not just starting with this blank slate. And so we need to think about like, okay, what kinds of environments, what kinds of experiences should kids be exposed to in order to facilitate better, adulthood?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about with COVID happening, and you spoke about like disgust might be something that is like central to the behavioral immune system. Obviously there's like a ton of factors with like financial insecurity, and like there's racism and so many different things that are pointing like us versus them. But we've really seen that recently. Do you think that the behavioral immune system has played a really strong part in that process as well?
I do, but I don't want to go too far with it. So I think that so even with just talking about disgust is a complicated topic, because disgust is not just one thing. You can think about disgust that's related to germs, but there's other kinds of like moral disgust that are a bit more tied in with how we see other people, other groups, and so on. And so I think that the kinds of prejudices and aspects of racism and discriminatory kinds of and even violent behaviors that we see are influenced certainly by the pandemic and what the pandemic is bringing to people. Some of that is disease threat. Some of it is other kinds of issues related to decreased social connection with people. But in addition to that, we've also had other kinds of sort of higher level societal factors playing a role, right? So you could think about government response to the pandemic playing a role. You could think about attitudes from leaders playing a role in terms of shaping people's expressions of prejudice. And so I don't think it's just the behavioral immune system, but I think that doesn't help.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking about people, like general topic of just like people wear masks, and there's like people who are the anti-maskers, and like it's a very polarized idea of like, you're this type of person, you're this type of person. And I could see how like you're not willing to be protecting of this pathogen, and so I'm gonna really like isolate you and see you as this bad person.
Yeah, and this is not necessarily new to this pandemic. So I mean, the kind of anti-mask and anti-solution approach has popped up in other pandemics, and so for whatever reason, I'm not sure exactly what that's the root of that, but I think that we have given it more identity now than it has been in the past. And so, yeah, the behavior itself hasn't just been kind of like a rebellion against other people. It's been part of who you are as a group member, right? So the whole idea of masks in general, we can think about them as these prophylactic germ prevention devices. And I think that's how maybe people at one point in the pandemic thought about them. But I think they gravitated then towards these cultural symbols of groups. So if you were part of the pro-mask group, you're part of the anti-mask group, people kind of, I think, to some extent, maybe in certain groups more than others, don't even necessarily think about them in terms of their disease prevention effects anymore. It's more just a symbol. And yeah, so that's part of the reason I think it's that is probably a little bit more difficult to explain from the behavioral immune system side.
Hmm.
maybe explainable from other kinds of factors associated with what's going on in the world right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was curious too. So I know that this is the behavioral immune system and physiological immune system are something that have developed and evolved over several years. But like, has there been research? I know there's ongoing research with this, I assume, but like what kind of impact this pandemic has? Like, can there be like a year-long significant impact on somebody's immune system because we've had to stay more indoors and not be outside?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question and definitely something that people are studying. Um, I, in terms of the physiology, I don't really know the answer. I think that um, we'll see. We'll have the data as this continues. Um, in terms of the psychological side of things, I mean, certainly it can, right? So to the extent that people are experiencing like chronic feelings of loneliness or lack of social support or connection, that affects both, the mental health, but it also affects physical health, right? So um, at least in one of the studies we've been doing, looking at people around the country, I think this was in late fall. We looked at rates of depression in this sample of people around the country, and it was about 2.5 times higher than it had been in the same period of time in 2019. And so lots of negative kinds of psychological experiences going on for people. Now, that's an easy number to say, but it turns out it varies widely depending on who you're talking about or what kind of groups they're a part of. So some people haven't experienced too much of a negative impact of the pandemic. Actually, it does depend on who you are, where you live, what kind of resources you have, and so on. And some people have really dramatically experienced negative impact of that. So I think that it'll be interesting to see if this event acts as essentially how long-term the impact of this event is going to be. And I think if we compare this to other events that have been like big events in human history, what we typically see is that people of certain periods of life or certain life stages are impacted by these large events. So some people experience those events and it impacts them in a chronic, like lifelong way. Some people are pretty resilient and they experience those things and it doesn't affect them that much. So for instance, there's a fair amount of work suggesting that very young children are impacted a lot by what's going on in the environment. And so we could think about kids as probably, maybe kids of a certain age span, as being most likely to carry the impact of the pandemic the psychological impact of the pandemic forward throughout their lives. But there could be other kinds of people at other life stages as well. So for instance, there's some work suggesting, this is totally unrelated, but suggesting that looking at CEOs of companies, and so people who become a CEO of the company, if they become a CEO in an economic downturn, then they make more risk-averse decisions. So they're more cautious throughout their entire tenure as CEO, even if the economy changes. People who enter in a economic upturn make more risky decisions throughout the entirety of their CEO experience. And so it's suggesting kind of like this kind of period of time or critical period where people get impacted because they're starting something new and they're trying to take in as much information about how to do it. And it sets the kind of trajectory in terms of like their behavior. And so we could think about that maybe with the pandemic as well, like for people who are experiencing shifts in their life of some sort.
Yeah, it's interesting because I hadn't even thought about this, but my grandfather was like a kid during the Great Depression, and I remember going over to his house when I was younger, and he had jars of coins all over the house. And it's just so interesting to think about that financial conservative nature was probably ingrained in him from a very, very young age. And like, yeah, it's interesting to think about what, maybe from a social interaction standpoint or a, change in education structure standpoint of how we're doing things now and how that's going to potentially impact that young generation now as they get older and what kind of differences we're going to see. It'll be very interesting. And hopefully not negative in any way of hopefully there's no negative outcomes to it, but we will see.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know a lot of kids are struggling with like online schools and those kinds of things. I mean, I guess if I had to make a prediction, I would say that the kids who are in late high school are probably going to be the least affected, because, I mean, assuming that they go back to school, interpersonally in the near future, because they will have had a significant period of time where they've already done that, and then they could return to that maybe after high school if they go to college. The people who maybe were freshmen in college could look very different, and people who are younger could look very different because they're experiencing these new periods of time, new life events, and then they're sort of setting what their expectations are for the future based on those.
Yeah, and now I'm thinking again about the behavioral immune system, with the vaccine starting to roll out.
Yeah.
Like that's just a huge factor that'll play into this. And I know that like good information getting out there is going to be really important in this process. But do you think that there is a kind of a concern or a weariness around this?
Yeah, it's actually a really topical thing, not just for everybody in the US, but here in Michigan. So I haven't gotten a vaccine yet, but I now have an appointment for one. And part of that process of getting it was exploring different options. And so I was looking both within Michigan and trying to see, would it make sense to even go to another state like Ohio, which is not that far away. And so Michigan, we have a constant shortage of vaccines. Ohio has a surplus because they have a lot of people who don't want them. And so you have these really different kinds of environments for things like how people are responding to the vaccine. Right? I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting research coming out around not just like public health related or epidemiological studies looking at vaccine rollout, but also psychological ones too. Right. So we've done some I would call it, preliminary opening remarks as part of the scientific conversation, maybe work on vaccine beliefs well before the pandemic, where we were looking at behavioral immune system effects and asking the question of, okay, we know there's some negative consequences like prejudices. Can we turn those off? Can we essentially interrupt them in some way? And so if part of the role of the behavioral immune system in crafting these expressions of prejudice or negativity towards other people is because people feel either increased disgust or increased feelings of threat around those environments where people are thinking about disease, then maybe if we can make them feel safe in some way, then they won't show those same kind of psychological outcomes. So we looked at things like people who got vaccines, like flu shots, seasonal flu shots, and people who, in experiments, we made them wash their hands. So events that they associate mentally, at least, with the idea of cleanliness and safety. And when people did those things, at least in these small studies that we did, it seemed to bring down these negative consequences. So people express less prejudice towards other groups after receiving the flu shot. And it would be a really interesting question to see, is that also happening with the pandemic? So we're actually doing some research like that to look across US states to track expressions of prejudice and racism and so on in social media, and see how that correlates with vaccine distribution rates in different states and different places, to see, is there some alignment there with more vaccines leading to less prejudice on the part of people. And then some other things. I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting kinds of consequences of feeling safe that people might experience from receiving the vaccine that could spill over into how they think about other people, how they behave, and so on.
Yeah, I'm curious about like the methods and measures of how you like measure how people express like prejudice.
Yeah, it's a good question because it's obviously not an easy thing to study all the time. There's obviously explicit measures of prejudice, so where you can ask people, how do you feel about these other groups, and if they're willing to say that they hate this group of people, then you probably are on relatively firm ground to say, hey, that person is expressing prejudice. But it's not always, right? Sometimes people just don't want to admit to it. So there's various kinds of implicit measures that people use to try to get at what's going on in their heads, even if you're not willing to admit it. We've done some different things. So in those early studies, we were looking at just explicit work. And so it turns out that although you would usually, I think, believe that people don't want to admit to being prejudiced, they do. And so we just on like measures of like, how do you feel about these groups? How warm or how cold, how favorable, disfavorable do you feel about these groups? You can see these kinds of trends depending on the groups that you're talking about. For the study I just talked about vaccine rollouts during COVID, this is not experimental. So instead, we are going to be tracking basically social media posts. So for instance, on Twitter, we can look for specific keywords. So we can track a huge amount of data in terms of the tweets that people are giving, tracking specific keywords. And then there's actually programs that people have written to basically categorize the content of messages, whether it's tweets or something else, into are people talking positively? Are people talking negatively? And other kinds of concepts like that. So you can run it through this information through these programs and get some sense of what kind of things people are expressing and to which groups. So maybe are they specifying China a lot? Are they using ethnic slurs? And that's probably a much stronger confirmation of prejudice. And so we can look at that and we can compare it to just publicly available data on vaccine rollouts and vaccine distributions in different states, counties, those kinds of things. And then just do some basic, I mean, it's not that basic, but it amounts to basically just correlating these two things to see are they unrelated, are they positively related, are they negatively related?
Yeah, I think this is so interesting because I remember listening to a podcast about this as well, and they found that like around really traumatic like maybe national events or world events, they saw that there were all these like negative emotions and different type of words that were being thrown on social media. And then there maybe were some really positive words during these really good moments. So I think that's such a interesting way to collect data. And yeah, I'm really curious about what some of these results and outcomes will look like.
Yeah, well, this is another point in favor of collaboration because I don't have the training to do this kind of work. And so, but there are, some of the best people to collaborate with are graduate students because they're constantly learning new things. And so we have a grad student who has done some of this work before, not on this topic, but doing some of these kind of machine learning paradigms to understand the content of social media posts and those kind of things. So he's going to be leading the charge on that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
As far as like, I know that throughout this whole, 2020 and into 2021, we've had quite the frenzy via the media about like the status of the country. I think in general has been all over the place. And I think there's been a lot of uncertainty. How has there been any like trending or looking at how maybe the different media messages that are getting put out there are affecting things like public perception and, how often people are going out, anger towards like the lockdowns and things of that nature and how it has impact. Have you done any research in that aspect at all, or have you?
I've looked at it a bit, but I haven't done any research on media per se. So as part of I'm still kind of immersed to some extent. I still have a foot in the camp of the sort of business research world. So I was in marketing before, and I've been doing this project in collaboration with a company, a marketing company, where we've been collecting data from people around the country and looking at predictors of things like what people are how they're changing their preferences for various types of consumer products, behaviors like travel and so forth. And as part of that, we're trying to understand what's predicting those changes. So we look at COVID-related issues and issues related to where people are getting their media and how much they trust it and so forth. And so, yes, people are pretty these days, I think, but I don't want to make too much about the uniqueness of today versus the past, because I think we overdo that sometimes. But it does seem like people are pretty, I guess one word for it is partisan, but it's kind of just they self-select into certain kinds of media sources and don't tend to look at others. And so we do see effects of the particular media that people are paying attention to. We don't have access to the specific content of the messages, but just the sources of that information do play a pretty big role in predicting whether people care that much about the pandemic.
Yeah, this is like such interesting stuff, and of course, like really trying times. But yeah, I'm hopeful that there can be a lot of like good research that comes out of it, and then we can learn a lot from it, and hopefully have a lot of progress and preparation for future events. Because
yes, there will be more.
Yeah,
that's one thing we can say.
When you look at a lot of the research going on with like your field and other people who are in your field too, what type of things are people looking at to help ensure that like we're getting the most out of the data that's being collected? Like, what do we stand to learn that's going to be the most valuable, at least in your context, maybe towards like dealing with these types of pandemics, as they likely will happen again? Maybe not in our life.
So yeah, I don't know if you realize what you just asked, but it is a tricky question. And the reason it's tricky is because, so this is not just because of the pandemic, but it's true. So anytime there are large events in the world that people care about, or where there is shifts in research funds and money going towards the studying of those things, what you tend to see is a lot of new people start to study those things. And that can be great on the one hand, because you get more eyes on the problems. But the downside is that you have a lot of people who've never done work on those topics before.
I was going to say, probably dilutes all the experts.
Yeah, so there's a lot of bad work out there, and I'm not like separating myself from that, but I think we're going to end up finding that that we can't really rely too much on a lot of the COVID-related research that has come out, especially early on, because it will have been very specific to the context where it was studied, that particular region or whatever it is, how it was studied. And there's just a lot of measurement-related problems if you're trying to just jump into a new field. And I've certainly experienced that with things like trying to understand how to measure physiological immune functioning. It's probably the hardest thing I've tried to understand. And so I think there's going to be a lot of, I guess, lack of reliability of the findings, which is going to muddy the waters about how do we interpret things. But in addition to that, there are people who have experience studying these topics, and we will be able to look at like large scale, like aggregating across lots of data. What are the big trends that pop out? And I think one of the interesting things, at least from my point of view, is trying to understand, for people who do work on the psychology of disease avoidance, like behavioral immune system work, is the pandemic creating the same kinds of reactions in people as we would expect based on all the research that had been done pre-pandemic, right? So is the pandemic a unique event that is different in certain ways than the work that's been done on disease, or is it compatible with that? So, and I think we don't know, because there's reasons to expect both possibilities, right? It's a big disease, so we would expect, okay, it's disease and people have studied disease, maybe we should predict that people are going to behave in the same way. But it's also, pandemics aren't something that, even though they're big events that definitely influence people strongly, there's lots of other additional reasons to expect that they might not always jive with the typical experiences that people have with infectious disease. It's one specific disease, it acts in one specific way. And it doesn't always give you the same kind of cues that a lot of the research that's been focused on in the past, right? So we talked about this idea of disgust as playing a big role in how people are reacting to disease, right? And that's because, you smell like some spoiled food, or you look at somebody and they have some type of lesion on their face due to infection. an common emotional reaction is disgust. But with COVID, you have a lot of asymptomatic people. There's no cues that you can sense. And if there are cues, then people are usually like isolated somewhere. So you're not actually interacting with them. They might be in the hospital, they might be quarantined at home, whatever it is. And so there's reasons to expect that people aren't going to react in the same ways, because part of the reaction that triggers these behavioral immune reactions is getting the information from your environment. And if the information coming in from other people isn't the same as what we've studied in the past and what represents like common infections, then we could expect that COVID could be a unique event in terms of its impact.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because even just like a lot of the research we've done on other like Ebola, for example, I know has been talked about as like a recent, like was that 2007 or 8? There was the recent Ebola event, and yeah, I mean, you could totally trace back every encounter and you can't do that at all in this case. So yeah, the data collection, even just the process of collecting accurate data is going to be extremely difficult to then analyze, which will be extremely difficult because, like you said, it's going to be completely unique. So will the data that's even informing the analyses even be accurate enough to like really validate? Because like you said, we've never done this type of circumstances before, at least to this event. So yeah, it'll be extremely unique. And I think, unfortunately, it's probably going to take a really settled feeling of this kind of being over before we can really start to take some detailed looks at it.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, especially in the US or other countries where there's been such wide variation in protocols. So like you have, 50 different states, 50 different protocols are going on, and people, some places are not doing sort of contact tracing or testing even to the rates that matter. So I think that some of the good data actually could come from outside the US. Yeah. Other countries that are smaller and that have had a more regulated kind of environment will be able to be more confident in the data that are coming out of those countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that piece that we're not able to identify like visual or maybe like sound, what COVID is, like that's just really playing into like the uncertainty and the fear, I feel. Well, for some people, right? Like,
yeah, you're right. Yeah, I mean, if you do have those cues, then we know that people are really responding to them. But again, if you have the cues, it doesn't also mean that those are real dangers, right? So you might see somebody, I know early on in the pandemic, when masks were not very normative in the US, right? So we did some work looking at people's perceptions of people wearing masks, and it was really negative. And the idea was, oh, this person's wearing a mask because they're sick, right? But with the whole idea of the mask is actually to prevent infection in other people. And so people don't always have those understandings. They react in certain kinds of ways that on average will help them out if you're avoiding people who have those cues, but it doesn't mean that it's societally acceptable or that it's a positive thing or what have you, right? So you might see somebody walking around who's sneezing and coughing, and they could be just having a bad allergy day. And you might associate them with COVID. And so, yeah, people are not good at detecting true disease. And so we rely on all these kind of prone to error cues.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating too that even just in you saying that, I hadn't fully thought through that before. People that definitely was a reaction, is that if you were wearing the mask, you were likely the one who is sick. And then all of a sudden the pandemic hits, and all of a sudden masks become the you're not sick prevention method of getting the. And it's so funny how the messaging was not, because I think the value of it's a much greater value, and this is just not official recommendation to anybody who is going to potentially hear this, but my understanding is that wearing a mask as an infected individual is a better defense for others than others having worn a mask. That's my understanding. It is more effective to put masks on sick people than masks on healthy people.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So generally speaking. So it's so funny to think that like the minute this pandemic hit, we were not thinking, like we were just thinking like throw a mask on everybody, and like the perception really turned into like, even if I'm not sick, I need to have a mask on. Like that's what's going to help me when, we just kind of went the opposite way with it. So I think that's,
part of the problem is just the asymptomatic thing, right? Nobody knew if they were sick.
Absolutely.
And so, what do you do in that case?
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes social interactions so awkward because, right, like I don't know if I'm safe in order and to get closer to somebody. Um, they're not, my behavioral immune system is maybe not triggered because they're not coughing or they don't have anything that they're presenting with. But then at the same time, there's this uncertainty in the back of my mind that's like, I should definitely still stay apart from them. Yeah, and I'm just curious about like how long that'll linger on. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, there's still recommendations to wear masks in social settings even after being vaccinated, and partly that's to help with the current situation in terms of just trying to reduce the spread as much as possible, because even with vaccination, spread could still happen and could create variants and so on in the disease. But it's also the normative side, just to make people feel like they should be wearing masks. So that is, but it's all about the current situation, right? So it'll be interesting to see once the pandemic is gone, if it ever is gone, what people end up doing. And I hear people saying they're going to keep wearing masks, or maybe only in certain seasons, but we'll see.
Yeah, I just keep
reminding myself. Some cultures, what's that?
Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, some cultures it is normative to wear a mask
right.
if you are sick, right?
Yeah.
And once that becomes truly normative, then you don't see people reacting in the same way to those people. It's not like you get suddenly avoidant of those people, but that requires large scale adoption of a cultural norm plus other types of cultural norms that help people not avoid. So I don't think we're going to get there anytime soon.
Yeah. I was just joking around. I was going to say, at least it's not the Antonine Plague, which lasted like 15 years or something. At least not yet. I mean, hopefully I didn't just jinx all of us, but in general, I think we got a much more technologically advanced society that we can handle things a little bit better. But yeah.
Yes. Knock on wood.
Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. We've really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you so much for taking this time. And we definitely want to allow you some time to get outside on a good Michigan day. So thanks.
Yeah, I had fun. It was a interesting conversation to have.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.